Okay, so for those of you watching on YouTube, or wherever you're going to end up watching, we do have some new technology. Allison is recording this using the church's camera and everything. I'm recording it on my computer. I'm not sure which one will actually end up being the official one that goes up on YouTube, so we will watch how that how the technology plays out. So we're just going to play with this for a couple weeks, and we'll settle in on good technology. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. We're talking about love. This came out of our study about obedience. We were talking about obeying God. And in that, we got to the point where we're saying, okay, we understand the importance of obeying Jesus, that our obedience is the expression of our faith. That's what faith is. Okay, so now we know we need to obey. What does he want us to do? And we saw it in the scriptures over and over again. We saw the situation where we saw God's will for our lives. He wants us to love. The greatest commandment is to love God. The second greatest is to love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus then reworded it slightly and said, I'm giving you a new commandment, to love one another as I have loved you, which I submit is a higher standard of love than loving somebody as you love yourself. Using self-love as your standard of loving other people isn't necessarily the greatest model. But loving other people as Jesus loves us, that is a grand model to follow. And that's the new commandment that he's given us. And I threw in some more just to get more detailed. He commands husbands to love their wives, commands wives to love their husband and children, actually exhorts them. We'll talk about Titus 2:4 a little bit later. And he commands us to love our enemies. Now this last one, this gets hard, obviously. Because how can I feel love toward my enemies? And as we'll go further into this study, we'll realize that he's not talking about what we feel. Okay? The love that he's talking about is not what we feel. And we're going to be looking at this into the words. Before we get there, I just want to focus a little bit on Jesus' commandment. And this, in John 3:35, he says, by this everyone will know you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. And I really thought about this verse in connection with what Bob was sharing last week when he was talking about Christianity in his part of the world where he does his ministry and his work. And he was talking about cultural differences. And we see this all over, and it's nothing new. But he's talking about the churches over there. I'm not going to use the country or Bob's last name because we are recording. But he's talking about the churches over there and the pastors and how essentially they're in it for the money and all of this. The culture of that area has seeped into the Christianity of that area. And that's nothing new. It happens all over. My daughter and I spent a week down in the Dominican Republic about 15 years ago now on a short-term missions field, and we could see the Dominican culture, how it influenced their Christianity. Mm-hmm. And I thought about that, and I thought, well, you know what? To be fair, it happens here in America too. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you ask anybody all over the world, you know, what's a Christian? We had some missionaries at our church years and years ago, and they served over in Vietnam, and actually in Indonesia. And he was saying that when you talk to them and you say, okay, describe an American Christian, what comes to their mind is Britney Spears.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Not because Britney Spears is necessarily an example of Christianity. I'm not going to sit here to judge one way or the other. But their thinking goes like this. America is a Christian nation.
So everybody's a Christian?
Everybody in America is a Christian. The famous people in America are the biggest Christians. And so that's how we are viewed, and no wonder the world hates us. Again, I don't mean that as a disparaging comment on Brittany. Brittany, I love you. Wherever you are, I love you. But that's the way the world views Christianity in America. And quite honestly, if I'm being real honest with myself, how many of us have sort of equated our Christianity with our conservative Republican values? I mean, I'm a conservative Republican, I'll admit that. But I have to also admit that you can be a liberal Democrat and still be a Christian. Okay? Yeah, I know I'm pushing it. Okay? And so, you know, our culture infiltrates our Christianity. And so I thought about that in terms of people like Bob and other people who are out all over the world trying to evangelize the world. And it occurred to me that if we view evangelization as a process where we are trying to make other people in the world think like we do, that isn't going to work. And Jesus never told us to do that. Instead, he says, all men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. And so it occurred to me that this love is the universal language. You know, we talk about even music being a universal language, but, you know, there's differences in music throughout the world. Love is the universal language. That's the way people are going to know we're Christians. They're not going to know we're Christians because we can recite the right theological ideas. Don't get me wrong, theology is important, and nobody loves theology more than me except for maybe Pastor. But, you know, I love to research and look at theology. It's fun. I love it when people ask me hard questions because I just love doing the research. But I have to realize that there's something bigger and more important, and that is that I actually learn how to love. And so for that, I have to ask the question, what is love? Okay? I'm a lawyer. We deal with definitions. Okay? Every document that we write, it starts off with a definitions paragraph. In this document, these words will have this meaning. So when Jesus is commanding us to love one another, what is he commanding us to do? And so now we're going to start on a fun study, and this is inspired by this book. It's entitled New Testament Words by William Barkley. He's the guy I go to when I want to understand Greek. He was well known as being a Greek scholar. He understands Greek. There are a lot of people who disagree with him, and I'll share some of that as we go along. But everything I've read by him has touched my heart and touched my brain too. And he seems to understand Greek. When he talks about Greek words, he doesn't only just look at how they're used in the Bible, but he sees how Plato used them, how Aristotle. He shows how the words developed and evolved over time. And so this book is one I picked up several years ago. It's entitled New Testament Words, and he goes through about 50 New Testament Greek words. And he has a chapter on each one. And he talks about them, talks about how they were used in classical Greek literature and how they evolved over time and what they mean. It's just a neat, encouraging book. So that's what I'm using as one of my source materials for this. And in this book, he talks about 4 different Greek words that are used that are translated as love. Now, this is nothing new for you folks in the room. But there are these 4 different words. And I've got a nice little table, and I got them nicely compartmentalized. And you have the noun version of the word, the verb form of the word, and don't get hung up on these endings. Those of you who know Greek far better than I do, and again, my disclaimer, I am not a Greek scholar. I am not a Greek scholar. Don't look to me for understanding about Greek. I will share with you what people smarter than I have written. But Greek is what is known as a synthetic language. English is analytical language. And analytical language, you form thoughts by combining a bunch of words together. With a synthetic language like Greek, you form thoughts by taking a root word and then adding stuff to the beginning and end of it, or changing up the endings and stuff. So, for example, where Barkley has philein there as the verb, most of us would say phileo. Phileo actually means I love. If you were to say he loves or she loves, it would have a different ending. So don't get hung up on the endings. Just nouns and verbs: eros, storge, philia, and agape. And just to let you know where I'm going, obviously the love that God has commanded us is the agape. He has not commanded these, because these are emotional, these are hormonal, these are all sorts of things that you can't command. But he has commanded us agape love. And so you got these 4 words. I want to look at each one of them a little bit. Eros is the romantic sexual side of love. Storge is the familial love. Philia is the emotional love. And agape is what I'm calling volitional. It is the love of the will. It's the love that we choose to have regardless of how we feel. Okay? And we'll get into that in a lot more depth. But as I'm putting this together, I've come across other authors, I'm not going to name names, who say, look, people like Barkley and C.S. Lewis as well. He wrote a book entitled The Four Loves, where he went through all this. I have some of his material in the study as well. Other writers are saying, look, Barkley, Lewis, you're making too big of a deal about this. Especially when you get down to this philia and agape. They're saying, these are really synonyms. These are really 2 words saying the same thing. And they've got good arguments showing how these words developed, and you start reading all this stuff, and now I'm sitting there as a lay person thinking, okay, who do I believe? And so, and it occurred to me that what is happening here, and I hate to use a sexist analogy, but sort of reminds me of the book. I haven't read it, but the title says law. Men are waffles, women are spaghetti. Okay? Men are waffles, women are spaghetti. The idea being that men, we compartmentalize. I like having a table up on the screen. I like having a table with each word in its own little waffle square, and it's neat, it's orderly, and I can take my table, and as I'm reading the Bible, I can say, okay, I've come across this word agape, that's what this means. Well, neither life nor language is that simple. And those with a more feminine mindset would have their spaghetti strands running through all of this, and you would tell me, rightly so, that, you know what? I've got eros up here as being romantic and sexual, but in a healthy marriage, there's going to be a lot of agape in the sexual, and there's going to be a lot of the emotional and the volitional. It's all flowing together, and it's all working together, and sometimes I have to get in touch with my feminine side to see all this. And so I struggle going back and forth, and I think this is what our Bible scholars are doing as well. They're going back and forth. Guys like Barkley and Lewis, they've got this nicely, neatly compartmentalized. Other writers are saying, no, it all flows together a lot more than you want to say. So much so that some of the writers are saying, these are just simply synonyms. 2 different ways of saying the same thing. I think that's going too far, but I can understand how they get there. Because, and Pastor mentioned this several weeks ago, even as we're reading the Bible, we can see different writers having different writing styles, using different vocabulary. We've got 40 different authors in the Bible, spanning over 1,500 years from beginning to end in terms of the writing. Language evolved over that time. Got 2 languages, at least 2 languages involved, Hebrew and Greek. And so you're going to have situations where different writers may use different words to say the same thing. We may find the same writer using different words, and we'll see some of that as well. And just for fun, I want to illustrate what I'm talking about with a couple of examples here. So, let me ask y'all who live down here in the South, what is that?
A buggy.
Shopping cart.
Shopping cart.
Shopping cart was what came to my mind.
A buggy.
A buggy, shopping cart. I was stunned. First time Carol and I go into Quality Foods or Ingles, and you've got the I don't know if I should call it pop or soda or Coke, whatever. It's in the cart, 3 for $10, and I go up to the line, and the girl behind the counter says, "Oh, you don't have to get those out of your buggy." And I look around. Where's my buggy? Buggy?
Called them that in Western Pennsylvania.
A buggy?
Yep.
Yeah, that's what.
Wow.
That explains.
That's a horse and buggy, isn't it?
I worked in a grocery store.
That is interesting that you say that. Because I was going to use another example, and I thought, no, I'm not going to use that, but now I am, since you said that, from Western Pennsylvania. Because when my kids were little, I used to always tell them stories about when I was a child. And I always started these stories by saying, when I was a little boy. And as a father, now as a grandfather, I'm still dealing with my grandkids, it thrills my heart to see their eyes light up every time I say, when I was a little boy, because they know a fun story's coming.
Yeah.
And it occurred to me that if Pastor Julian were going to tell the story, he would say, whenever I was a little boy. Because I've noticed that Pastor says whenever, when I would use when. And I thought to myself, he must be from Pennsylvania, because the only time I've ever heard people doing that are people from Pennsylvania. So that when you say that, there's got to be a link between Pennsylvania and Savannah, Georgia. I don't know what it is.
Pennsylvania is two different languages,
Okay.
Eastern and Western.
Yeah, right.
Totally
Okay.
unrelated.
Okay.
Eastern Pennsylvania is really part of New Jersey.
Gotcha.
My
Okay.
grandparents lived up there, so maybe that's where I got it.
Aha! I knew there had to be a Pennsylvania, I don't know. So, but language, that's the way language is. And for those of you who realize it, that's a buggy. Okay? And you'll see those all over Holmes County, Ohio.
Yeah.
Okay? That's a buggy. Let me give you another example, and just to show how language evolves. And this is one that is near and dear to my heart. What is that?
Ahora speaking, respondemos por favor. That's French.
Okay, it's an invitation. Okay? But what else is it called?
An invite.
An invite. I gotta tell you, as a man who loves language and is a little bit obsessive about it, when I hear somebody call that an invite, it's like nails on a chalkboard. It drives me nuts. Because I've watched how this has evolved. I mean, the first time I heard somebody call this an invite, it would have been somebody like Ernest T. Bass on Maybe. Send me an invite, Sheriff Taylor. And to me, that was just an expression of ignorance to hear somebody call this an invite.
People buy insurance here too.
Yeah. It's not the emphasis on the wrong syllable. It is using a noun, a verb as a noun.
Yes.
Okay? And that drives me nuts. And so I was armed for bear. I was going to go to the dictionary. I went to Webster's online dictionary, and lo and behold, they have this question phrase. Is invite really a noun? And this is how they explain it. Yes, some people feel strongly that the role of invite should be restricted to that of a verb. But the English language changes and grows according to its own peculiar whims and not those of people who write angry letters to dictionaries. The process whereby a word changes its part of speech is called functional shift. And there are tens of thousands of words which have done this. And so I hung my head in sheepish humility and realized, you know what?
You could have written that letter.
I did not write the letter. But I thought all the thoughts that were in the letter. This is the way language works. And I'm now old enough that I've seen it happening in my lifetime. So that what used to be improper word usage is now mainstream. And it becomes mainstream, so then it makes its way into the dictionaries. Keep in mind what dictionaries do. Dictionaries do not dictate to us what is right. They report to us what we are all saying. Okay, and this is true of Greek dictionaries as well. When you pick up your Strong's Greek lexicon, it's not giving you the definition that should have directed John and Paul when they wrote the Bible. It's giving you the definition that they gleaned from the writings of John and Paul. They're trying to report to us what John and Paul meant, not dictate to us what John and Paul should have meant. And I have to constantly retrain my brain in that regard to realize that dictionaries are reporting. I say all of this to say that when we get to my neat little waffle here with all the words in a neat little row, the Bible isn't like that. You're going to find times in the Bible where you're going to see philia when you thought you would see agape. You're going to see agape when you thought you were going to see eros. Okay? For example, the Song of Solomon. In the Greek translation of the Song of Solomon, you would think that eros would be all over it. Not used there at all. It's all agape. All agape. And so this is just a way of trying to say that different writers may use different words differently. This doesn't mean that there's no distinction between the words. It just means that different people use them differently. And I think we have to realize that this is true even in the Bible. And I don't want to step on toes here, but I think we need to realize that yes, God inspired the scriptures. No question he inspired it. He may have even verbally inspired it. But that doesn't mean that every instance of the word agape by every writer throughout the scriptures means the same thing, or is intended to mean the same thing, or that every instance of phileo in the scriptures means the same thing. Okay? We have to be fluid. We have to realize that different writers will use different words. But I do think that there's enough distinction and enough pattern that we can see some growth here.
That's where the context strengthens the word that's being used, I think.
Absolutely.
It's got to be within that context, and that's why, and you know, that's interesting that you said that about the Song of Solomon, because anybody reading that would think that the eros is where he's coming from with that, but it's really, and I've never looked at the Greek to study that or anything, so, but it's just really neat that that was not Solomon's focus.
Or it may have been his focus, and at that time, he used a different word.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
so you can go either way on that.
Yeah.
But and that's not my point. My point is that words are helpful, but they're frustrating.
They
Okay?
can be, yeah.
We use
Right.
words to try to understand what people mean. And this is why we have thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of books telling us what the Bible means.
Yeah, right.
Okay? and because we can't decide. But I just wanted to get this background so that we can have a sense of the fluidity of words, fluidity of language. So with that, let's go ahead and look at this word eros. And we'll even see some differences in some of the people I'm quoting up here now. Gregory Nazianzen, one of the Cappadocian fathers, one of the church fathers in the early centuries. He was good friends of Gregory of Nyssa and Basil the Great. And I like Gregory. He's a good, cool guy. But he called eros the hot and unendurable desire. Okay? These aren't words that I should probably be using in Sunday school, okay? But I hope I have a mature enough crowd that we can deal with this. It's a passionate love. When you look at it from hot and unendurable desire, it's almost a very self-focused, passionate desire. I don't just love you, I want you, okay? And it has all the sexual overtones that go along with it. C.S. Lewis said this in his book, The Four Loves. By eros, I mean, of course, that state which we call being in love. And here I think he sort of expands on it. Being in love, at least the way I think of that, is far more than just passionate desire. Being in love involves the emotional philia love as well. It's all those emotions that nobody can describe and nobody can explain. That's why I'm not even trying. But Barkley says, falling in love, there's no great virtue in it. It just happens. You don't make yourself do it. You can't keep yourself from doing it. It just happens. It comes to you unbidden. And so being in love is how Lewis puts it. And because of this, like I say, in Gregory's view, it's a very self-focused, but with Lewis, there's a give and a give and a give and a receive in it. In fact, he goes on to say, for one of the first things eros does is to obliterate the distinction between giving and receiving. And I thought, wow, that's cool. That jumped off the page at me. One of the first things eros does is to obliterate the distinction between giving and receiving. And I'll be honest with you, we as Christians, we don't know what to do with this word eros. Because of its sexual nature, and we're not supposed to talk about sex in church, and we're not even supposed to acknowledge that it exists. It's there. And it's good to acknowledge it exists, and it's good to think about it in healthy ways. And this, what Lewis says here, I think is a very healthy way of looking at it. That it obliterates the distinction between giving and receiving. And I'll just leave it at that. I think that's a really cool thing to say. When I say we don't know what to do about eros, if you look at your Strong's Greek dictionary, it's not even in there. And I'll explain why in just a second. Proverbs 4:6. I've got some examples of where eros is used in the scriptures. Proverbs 4:6. This is from the Septuagint. Understand this. And this is where language gets really weird. The Septuagint, as we know, is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. Now, in English, we have this single word love, by which we try to describe all of these feelings and thoughts and attitudes. We say I love you when we mean eros. We say I love you when we mean storge. We say I love you when we mean philia. And we say I love you when we mean agape. So you can have a conversation with somebody and say I love you, and they say I love you too, and you both mean totally different things. That's one of the curses of our English language. The Greeks were kind enough to sort of split it out for us to give us the different nuances and flavors. Go back to Hebrew, and it's more like English, at least from what I've been able to find so far. I found in Hebrew, the word for love generally speaking, is ahab, if I'm pronouncing that right. I know less about Hebrew than I know Greek. But I found the Hebrew word ahab. And when the translators translated from Hebrew into Greek, they took that Hebrew word ahab and translated it into eros, philia, agape. There's probably some story in there somewhere, I'm not sure. And so the Greek translators, they were giving their translation of this Hebrew ahab into different flavors of love. So they were looking at the context. They were looking at the context, trying to say, okay, what's this really about? And so we have these two verses that are looking at eros from a fairly positive point of view. In 4:6, and forsake it not, referring to wisdom, and it shall cleave to thee. Love it, and it shall keep thee. Now this is from the English translation of the Greek Septuagint. And so this love here is eros. Solomon is telling his reader, have a passionate, unquenchable desire for wisdom. Love it, reach for it, grab for it, do everything you need. In Esther, we have the story of the king and all the harem and the virgins. He's looking for a replacement queen, sort of like the Old Testament version of The Bachelor. And you've got all these women going through the beauty treatments and the diet for a year just to try to make themselves, let's say it, I'll just say it, sexually attractive to the king. And they do all this. And in chapter 2, and the king loved Esther, and she found favor beyond all the other virgins, and he put on her the queen's crown. The love there is eros. Again, both of these are translating the Hebrew word ahab. In other books, we see eros having a more negative connotation. We see this in Hosea and in Ezekiel. And both of these referring to basically illicit lovers. And now I will expose her uncleanness before her lovers, and no one shall by any means deliver her out of my hands. And Ezekiel and Ahula went a-whoring from me. Ahula is a reference to Samaria. Went a-whoring from me and doted on her lovers, on the Assyrians that were her neighbors. Again, the idea there's adulterous relationships going on here. And this word for lovers is a form of eros. And so with eros, we have both positive and negative uses. Again, this is Old Testament in the Greek translation of the Hebrew. When we get to the New Testament, the word's not there at all. Period. It's not used. Which is why you won't find it in Strong's dictionary, because Strong's isn't a dictionary of the entire Greek language. It's a dictionary of the Greek words used in the New Testament. And it ain't there. The closest we get is that there is a guy by the name of Erastus who Paul's referring to in his letters. That's the closest we get. And I don't even know, even if Erastus, the name comes from Eros. But it's not there. It does appear in the Old Testament, in the Septuagint Greek translation. There are about 19 references. This is according to Barkley. I have not looked at them all, but there are 19 references. And again, as I said before, there are 0 references in the Song of Solomon. It's not there. Again, that's just a matter, I think, of the word choice of the translators of the word. Obviously, this is not the love that's commanded by Jesus in John 13 and 15. When he says, this is my commandment, that you love one another, he's not commanding eros. Let me go through one more, and then we'll come back next week. We're talking now about storge. Storge is family affection. It's the bond that you have with family members. We say that blood is thicker than water. There's something that happens on a hormonal, genetic level. This is going to sound weird, and it's just going to sound weird. I married kind of later in life. I was 27. I won't tell you how old Carol was, because that's not fair. But I was 27 when we got married, and so that was kind of later, at least in my generation's time. And by the time I got married, I had been working in a legal setting for a local court up in Ohio, and we had a lot of cases where we, had divorce situations and child custody disputes, and I remember thinking to myself, why is it that people are so willing to do armed battle against each other over the custody of children, ripping these poor kids apart? I always thought that is the most unloving thing that you can do. But I will say this, when our firstborn daughter was born, Bethany, it suddenly made some perverse sense to me. Not that I would ever glimmer about leaving Carol and going through all that. That never crossed my mind. But the thought did occur to me, I can see myself doing battle over this baby. There was a bond there. We often talk about the bond of the mother and the child, that they get through all the biological things going on there. But there's a bond with the dad too, and that's real. That's real. Okay? I mean, probably the best way that I can explain it, and it's kind of a disgusting way, I didn't mind changing my children's poopy diapers. If you put another kid's poopy diaper in front of me, I would throw up. Okay? But there's something about your own kids, it's just no big deal. You just do what you gotta do. Okay? I don't know. Okay. There's
Very
really
good description, Virgil. Very good.
Yes.
Except that I know some guys that no matter who it is, the poopy guy.
Yeah, I know, but I didn't mind it with my own kids, but there's something there that is undescribable, unexplainable. Plato puts it this way, according to Barkley: a child loves, stergine, the verb form, and is loved by those who begat him. In terms of the Bible, it only appears really one time in any kind of form. In Romans 12:10, be kindly affectioned one toward another with brotherly love, in honor preferring one another. The Greek words in that verse, we have Philostorgos for kindly affection, and then Philadelphia. I mean, that, if you look at the Greek letters, that's what it spells in English.
Yep.
Philadelphia for brotherly love. So Philostorgos is a blending of philia and storge, and so this is really the only location in the scriptures that uses storge, at least in the New Testament. I haven't checked the Septuagint of the Old Testament. It just isn't used that often. And so next week we'll come back, we'll do philia, and we'll do agape, and we'll see how they work together and how they do work together, but they're different. And so we'll look at those next week. Let me